It makes sense. We've been overrated. They've underperformed us all year, just because we've been winning games with not great dominant showings.
Yeah. All right. Well, whenever we get complete silence, if you guys want, I will.
3, 2, 1.
I need absolute silence. I need absolute silence. All right. Here we go. 3, 2. Hi, and welcome to the Testudo Times podcast, our first in far too long. I'm Alex Kirshner. I'm here with Dave Tucker, Pete Volk, and Andrew Emmer, and we're going to spend a lot of our day today getting into Maryland basketball's recent troubles over its last 5 games. We'll touch on tonight's Maryland-Indiana game, which tips at 9 p.m. at Xfinity Center. And Andrew and I, as well as Dave and Pete, will get into a somewhat analytically based conversation about Maryland's offense and about whether or not Maryland really is that good, like so many of us thought at the beginning of the season. So without much further ado, we'll get into it, and I'll start with Pete. Maryland has had a 5-game stretch in which it has averaged less than 63 points a game, which is downright Nebraskan, if I may say so, and struggled to beat 2 very, very mediocre Big Ten teams, lost to 3 formidable Big Ten teams. What do you make, Pete, of what has gone on in the last 3 weeks with this Maryland basketball program?
Well, I'm pretty concerned. I became a lot more concerned after the Iowa game, just because before that I think it was easier to dismiss that as just a blip of the radar. I think that there's no reason that this team couldn't come back and return to its previous heights. I think that the talent is there. I mean, we've seen it mesh all together before in Big Ten play against good teams. But as of right now, they're in a funk, and I think it's safe to be a bit concerned until they get out of it.
Dave?
Well, I think they're really having a trouble with zone defenses right now, and teams are cutting off Des Wells and Jake Lehman and Melo Trimble from being able to get to the basket consistently, and that's also cutting down on their free throws. They were getting to the line about 27 times a game. More recently, they've only been getting there about 18 times a game, and that's made a big difference for them. It's made a big difference in how they play and how they're able to score and run their offense. And I think until they can figure out a way to get around these zones and get better play out of their front court, and their front court has really struggled over the past several games. I mean, John Graham has probably been their best front court player, and saying that is kind of like saying Dave Neal is your center. And, until they can get around that, I think they're going to continue to struggle, and Big Ten teams are going to continue to do the same thing that other teams have done to slow them down.
And Andrew, do you see some way for Maryland, given that its best players typically take up residence away from the basket, for them to be successful even if the big men do not come along?
Yeah, I mean, I think that they definitely can get out of the slump because they've been better, and it hasn't been that long since they've been good. It's been a few weeks, and that last stretch against Northwestern was some of the best basketball they've played all year. So it really, they've shown stretches of being some really good play, and I'll even include the second half against Iowa, where they shot over 50%, and were really running a pretty effective offense. Obviously, it was just too much of a hole to get out of, but you don't need dominant big men or even very good big men to win in college basketball. It's a completely guard-dominated league, and you see that when you have really good big men like Kentucky does, like Wisconsin has one of them, you have a huge advantage over everyone else because those players just aren't common amongst college basketball teams these days. And like Pete said, I'm concerned. I'm concerned in the sense that they haven't been playing well. It's undeniable they haven't been playing well. But I'm not worried for the future because we were spoiled over the first few months of the season. Melo Trimble, who I expected, and I was as high on Melo Trimble as you can be as high on a freshman coming into a season. I thought he would maybe score 10 points a game, get a few rebounds, a few assists a game. He's obviously outperformed that. So if you have a player like him, and we'll get into Des Wells a little bit later, but if you have a player with his ability and you have a player with Jake Layman's athleticism and pro potential, you can come out of it. You can beat anybody. But it's just a matter of putting it back together and getting out of the slump. And I do just think it's a slump and not a. I think they're. Let me put it this way. I think they're more like the team we saw earlier in the year than they are like the team we've seen in the last 5 games.
I think that's an interesting point that you mentioned about Maryland's big men not necessarily being the focal point, not needing to be the focal point. But I think part of what I've seen as Maryland's problem in the last couple of games has been that on both sides of the court, ball screens have not been kind to Maryland, and that's one thing that even on a very rudimentary level, you need your big men for, either to play ball screen defense, to close out at the top, or float back to the basket when the ball comes into the post. Maryland, particularly, I think its ball screen defense has been really bad. That's caused its own set of problems on the defensive end of the floor, and obviously Maryland's pick and roll game all year has just not existed. And I think that given the amount of time that Melo Trimble spends with the ball in his hands and that Des Wells spends with the ball in his hands, if Maryland could play an effective pick and roll kind of game offensively, I think it would add a terrific dimension that might deal with some of the 2-point problems we'll get into later. But I just haven't seen that.
I think, though, that when they were at their best earlier in the year, they weren't a pick and roll team because they're trying to run the Maryland motion offense. Motion offense, by definition, is not pick and roll. It's a lot of movement off the ball. It's back cuts. It's a lot of screens, off-ball screens and pin downs and that kind of action, and not the traditional pick and roll. So, earlier in the year when Maryland was at its best, and again, we'll get into this later because I have a kind of a hot Des Wells take, they weren't. The ball was moving around a lot. Melo wasn't getting a lot of assists because the ball was just constantly moving, and a lot of Melo's points and most players' points came off catch and shoots and post-ups, and not necessarily, isolation plays like we've been seeing a lot now. And I really think that Maryland's offensive struggles have been what led to their defensive struggles. Their defense is still a top 40 defense. And by top 40, I mean it is 40th. So technically a top 40 defense. It is still ahead of their offense, which I think is in the mid-60s now, according to KenPom. But I think that their offense has been so bogged down recently that it's hurt their defense. They've had to a lot of times you'll see, especially with the young teams, and Maryland is still fairly young, even though they have Des Wells and Evan Smotrich and Jake Layman as a junior as major contributors. A young team like this their offense feeds off their defense, and the defense feeds off their offense. So if one of them is really underperforming, the other one is probably going to underperform too, and that's where we see the snowball effect.
I think Pete, did you want to add something to that?
No, I think that it's really going to be a key stretch of games coming up for Maryland. I know that we're going to talk about Indiana in a second, but I think we're going to tell a lot about this team and where it's heading into March, because we're almost there. I mean, we're midway through February now. The season is starting to come to a close, and college basketball is a much longer season than college football, but you can sometimes feel like a team hasn't had enough time to fully come together. Maryland still needs to come together more fully, and they have the opportunity to do so before conference tournament time starts.
Andrew mentioned that, in your mind, Andrew, that Maryland's defensive problems of late have stemmed from its offensive problems, and that brings us to actually what I wrote yesterday over on the site, a kind of evaluation of where Maryland stands offensively at the moment. And what might have ailed it in the last 5 games. Again, a period here in which the Terps have scored not even 63 points per game, which is frankly horrid. It's a terrible offensive stretch. Dave, in your mind, if you could boil down Maryland's offensive struggles in the last 5 games against 5 altogether not that stellar defenses, how would you assess what's gone wrong?
Well, I think one thing they've really struggled with over the past 5 games, especially the past 4 games, really, is they're not shooting well from beyond the arc right now. They're shooting less than 30% over the past 4 games. They're shooting something around 28%. And that really impacts pretty much everything they do on offense because so much of it seems to stem from them being able to stretch out a defense and have a defense have to play man D instead of zone D. And when they make another team go into man D, then you allow Des Wells to run isolation plays. Melo dribble can break someone down off the dribble and get to the basket. Jake Layman can attack from the top of the key or from the wing and get to the hoop easily. And I think it just opens up their offense so much more. And when they're struggling there, then it really stymies their offense a lot. And for whatever reason, I don't know why, but it seems like starting so many of these games, I don't know if they're not ready, if they need to get pumped up more, but they're just starting in these huge lulls, and they're not scoring for 5, 6, and even 10-minute stretches. And when that happens and the other team is able to just open up and build a big lead, then they're constantly fighting to get back, and that obviously changes how you have to approach the game as well. So they really need to be able to start off strong, start being able to hit three-pointers again. I think it'll really just open everything up for them.
I do suspect that at some point the three-point shooting will come back, especially if you look at a guy like Jared Nickens, who had been a stone-cold gunner really for this team for the vast majority of his freshman year here. He hasn't hit a three in a couple of starts, and he's been just generally, I think, a little bit off-kilter. But one of the things that's interesting that you mentioned, what is it that's causing Maryland to start games slow out of the gate? That was a pretty popular topic today when Mark Turgeon had his media availability and when his players did after that. And the question that was put to Turgeon was, do you think you've had the right level of intensity to start games? And he says yes. There's no doubt on Maryland's part, and his players backed him up on this, that they've come to the building ready to play. I mean, they haven't walked into the gym, at least in their minds, with any kind of drawback in intensity. I mean, they've been in the moment at least. But you're certainly right that Maryland has found itself down by between 5 and 10 points, or in this case 15 points, as it was on Sunday, exceptionally quickly for a team that hasn't trailed a lot this season.
I think this brings me to my point about how the defense is the poor defense in games is a result of the poor offense. I've noticed that early in games, their defense is on. They've gotten some stops, they've gotten some turnovers, they've gotten some really nice early defensive possessions in almost all these games they've played, and it's just the offense has been so bogged down and so unable to score at the beginning of the games that it becomes too much for the defense, and fairly quickly because the offense has been that bad. I remember, for example, during the Penn State game, they played some really good defense early on, but I think it was Shep Gardner and DJ Newbill hit some really it was Geno Thorpe hit like 3 circus shots in the first 10 minutes of the game, and you nothing you can do about that. Maryland's defense needs to be better overall, but that kind of stuff is demoralizing. That kind of stuff plus the having to make up for huge deficits because the offense can't score at all is, I think, where we're getting, again, the snowball effect. And I have one more theory about the snowball effect. I think that the unfamiliarity of conference play, how Maryland is just not familiar with any of these teams being in a new conference, can lead to a snowball, can lead to what should just be maybe a 10, 12-point blowout becoming a 17, 20-point blowout.
And Andrew, to your point, I think if you go back and look at these past 5 games and you look at the kind of game tracker to where the score margin is, offense isn't, a lot of time Maryland is just not up. So you have like a 4 or 5 point deficit, and then all of a sudden it slowly balloons into something much higher.
Yeah, I mean, almost all of these games, I think maybe perhaps besides the Ohio State game, the big deficit has come off of 1 or 2 really massive runs by the other team. I think outside the 22-3 run, which, I mean, it's really hard to say outside of a 22-3 run because that is just too much of a run to overcome for anybody. But outside the 22-3 run against Iowa, Maryland won the game. I mean, they outscored Iowa after that run. The Indiana run, there was that stretch in the second half. I mean, if you remember, Maryland, I think, was only down 1 or 3 at halftime to Indiana, and Indiana then went off for 80% from three-point land in the second half. And against Ohio State, it was a little bit more spread out, but there was a stretch in the second half where D'Angelo Russell took over, where Mark Loving took over, and Maryland was just not able to do anything on offense themselves. It is really concerning, and to get back to maybe a reasoning behind it, I'll just unleash my Dez Wells hot take right now. I love Dez Wells. I think he's was an excellent player when Maryland needed a player like him at the time they brought him in. But at the time that Mark Turgeon brought in Dez Wells, Maryland was desperate for talent on the roster. They had nobody. And Pete actually had thought about that in relation to Randy Edsall. Perhaps he'll share with us afterwards the kind of parallels the two programs. But I really don't think a player like Dez Wells is the kind of player that Mark Turgeon wants to build his system around. And that's potentially why Maryland was so much better without Dez in the lineup. Now, I don't think that that's a fatal flaw, and I think that a player like Dez Wells can fit on this current Maryland team. But I think that he needs to maybe take a step back and realize that he needs to stay within the system, stay within himself, stay within what Turgeon is telling him to do. There's been so many times during these games where you can see a play forming, you can see the motion off the ball, you can see the screens being set, you can see the pin downs, you can see all that stuff, and then Dez just kind of decides that he's going to take the ball and muscle to the basket or take an ISO in the wing. And that kind of worked on the last few teams when there was really no one else who trusted to take a shot. But Maryland has one of the best point guards in the country when he's on in Melo Trimble. They have Jake Layman, who's had a fantastic year up until recently. They even have Jared Nickens, and these guys are not getting the touches that they should be getting because Dez is still in the mindset of I need to take over this game, where he may be hampered by injury. I don't even know if that's true anymore, but he is breaking the offense consistently.
And I think just to that point, for a kind of picture of how significant that phenomenon has been for Maryland, Dez Wells has the 7th or 8th highest offensive rating on this team. It's 97.9, which, interestingly enough, is the exact same efficiency rating of one Evan Smotrich. Yet Wells takes, when he is on the court, 29% of Maryland's shots. Nobody else on the team at any point, 29.4 if we want to be technical about it at the moment, heading into this game against Indiana. Nobody else on the team at any point has more than a 24% proportion of Maryland shots taken. Maryland has nobody who dominates the ball like Dez Wells, and they have very few players in their rotation who make shots at a lower rate than Dez Wells. So I think on some level that's something that's worth pursuing. Pete, you had a thought as well, correct?
Yeah, well, I agree with that, and I think that, like Andrew said, there is a way for Dez Wells to function within this offense. He's a terrific player in transition. His three-point shooting has improved greatly, and he can break down defenses when need be. But when he's the focal point of this offense, the offense changes, and that's what we've seen a lot. You talked earlier about Jared Nickens, Alex. I think he was really an important factor in Maryland's early season success because he had a similar shot load to Wells, but he took different kinds of shots. He took more threes. He's really capable as a freshman of being able to create his own opportunities. A lot of that is because of his length. A lot of that is just his tenacity. But he really was a key factor just in putting up buckets when the offense wasn't working. And he hasn't had such a big role. He's struggling a bit too. But, I think the more that they can get him involved, the better Maryland's offense will run.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, I really love the way Jared Nickens was playing. Back to your thing about Dez Wells fitting into the team, before I forget. Not only is he very good in transition, he's Maryland's only good transition player. No one else on the team is a very good transition player. Perhaps maybe Melo Trimble, but even Melo, when Dez was out, didn't show a great knack at scoring in transition. He would get fouled in transition, but not really score in transition.
I think to that, Dion Wiley should get there.
Yeah, but not yet. he's made a lot of weird decisions in transition. I think down the road he can be an excellent transition player, but not quite yet. And like Alex said, Dez dominates the ball more than any player on Maryland, and I really think that if any player on Maryland should dominate the ball, it needs to be Melo Trimble. I don't think he's dominating the ball enough, to be honest. And I know that as a point guard, you're not supposed to do that, and he was awesome as a passer and a facilitator against Penn State. Maryland hasn't had a player that's done that since Greivis Vasquez. That was incredible, especially in the second half. But he needs to take more shots. It's pretty simple. There are a lot of shots a lot of opportunities he's getting. Maybe not wide open shots, maybe not perfect shots, but shots where a guy goes under a screen on him, or he gets the ball at the top of the key, and there's a little bit of a lane where he'll dish it off to Dez or dish it off to Layman, and he really should just be taking it himself. And I understand as a freshman, as a point guard, that's not, that's hard to do. It's hard to, say, okay, forget about the seniors, forget about leaders who are, my good friends and people I look up to, at a personal level. But he needs to do it because he's the best player on the team.
And I think that something else that we should consider about Maryland's offense, obviously Dez Wells has taken on a significant role relative to virtually everybody else in terms of shooting the ball and using possessions. But I wanted to get your guys' opinions on this because this was something that I was kind of wrestling with in this piece I wrote yesterday. In Big Ten play, Maryland has gone from being one of the slower-paced teams in the country to being the fastest team in the Big Ten by a full possession per game, which doesn't sound astronomical, but which actually is a pretty significant gap when you look at how tightly clustered teams are in terms of their tempo over the course of the season. Maryland's offense has nosedived. They are now 12th in the conference out of 14 teams in offensive efficiency as Ken Pomeroy measures it. They have fallen to 13th out of 14 teams in effective field goal percentage, which is obviously the overarching measure of how well a team shoots. And this has coincided with Maryland playing faster than anybody else. What do you make of that?
I think that one issue leads to another with Dez Wells. I think that, a lot of it has to do with the way that he plays. And again, I don't mean to be bashing on Dez Wells because he's a very, very good player who did some terrific things and has done terrific things this year. But the way he plays is not conducive to how Maryland plays if he's going full Dez Wells. There are moments where Maryland needs that. There really are, especially when the offense is struggling, and it has. It's just been, I think, maybe a bit too much of it recently, and as a result, you see a faster-paced play. I do think Maryland can succeed playing a high-tempo game, but I think that they're more comfortable a little slower.
I think I'll disagree with you, actually, Pete, and I will. And I'm accused, and I know it's probably a well-deserved moniker of being sort of a Turgeon apologist because I do think he's a very good coach. But I think that the idea that they can succeed and should be a fast-paced team is, I think, wrong. And Turgeon said today to the media, I don't know exactly what outlet it was, that he knows that they're fast and he thinks they should be faster. And that was honestly, of all the things, and Turgeon gets criticized for a lot of things, and a lot of them I find really dumb. I'll criticize Turgeon for that. They were at their best. They were at their best when they were in the 250s of national pace of play. When Dez Wells was out, and when it was the Jake Layman, DeMonte Dodd, Melo Trimble, Jared Nickens show, they were at their best when they would get a fast break opportunity and not take it. They would slow it down and run a secondary break. And I think it's actually appropriate with Dean Smith's recent death, the legendary UNC coach, that the Carolina break, which Dean Smith invented when they implemented the shot clock. That's what they were great at, Maryland, early in the year. The secondary break, not exactly the Dez Wells taking the ball, running down the court as fast as he can, and going up for a layup or getting fouled. It was okay, let's get down the court quickly, set up a quick play, and then while the defense is still on their heels, get a three or get a backdoor cut and score that way. And that's when they were playing at their best, not when they were just sprinting in transition up and down the court.
And something that's interesting, Andrew, about that is that Des Wells this year has actually been by far at his best when he's been doing the things that none of us consider to be Des Wells things. He's been very selective about what kind of three-point shots he takes, and he's hit 17 out of 33 on the year, which is 52%. He's been at 76% at the foul line, I think, which is a slight drop off of where he was last year, but still totally acceptable. Where he's had his biggest problem, and where the rest of his Maryland teammates are a mirror image of him, is on everything inside the arc, other than foul shots. He's shooting 41% on 2-point tries, which I think is very consistent with problems on the break that Maryland's had all year. And interestingly enough, it's the same 41% that Maryland is shooting in conference play when it gets inside the arc. I mean, Maryland around the basket, and part of this could be chalked up to its lack of a dominating offensive post presence, but part of it, I think, has to do with its forwards and its guards. Maryland has been, there's no other way to put it, they've been just abysmal at scoring the ball near the basket. I mean, they've been one of the worst teams in the country at it, actually, for most of the season. They're scoring, I think, the 327th highest proportion of their points from inside the arc, and part of that's that they take a lot of free throws, part of that's that they make a lot of threes, but a big part of it is that Maryland just cannot finish at the basket.
I think that you said that they don't have a dominating post player. They don't have any post players. I mean, Des Wells is probably their best post player. Des Wells and Jake Layman, and that's a 3 and a guard, and I know that Jake's been playing the 4 most of the year, but essentially a 3 and a guard. That's a huge problem, and I know I said earlier that you don't need good big men to be a good college team. I think that you do need a big man or anyone that you can put in the paint and the defense has to pay attention to. Maryland has none of those players right now.
You know, you're going to laugh at me, Andrew, and I hate to cut you off, but you'll laugh. You know that John Graham has a 109 offensive rating this year and is shooting 57% from the field?
Yeah, that's in limited time. How many minutes is he playing a game?
I mean, he's playing about a third of Maryland's minutes, but I think this is
okay. But how many offensive touches does he get per game? Because he doesn't get a ton of opportunities.
He takes 13% of the shots when he's on the floor, and I wonder what it might be like if he took 20.
I mean, listen, John Graham's explosion against Penn State was one of my favorite Maryland things in a long time. That was hilarious. That was really funny because Penn State fans hate John Graham, and he would be their second best player right now.
He'd be probably their best big man.
Oh, he'd definitely be their best big man, but I think he'd probably be their second best overall player.
You can make that case. You can make that case.
And yeah, Dave, you can go ahead.
I think one issue that Maryland's also had when they are getting around the basket is I think a lot of times they're expecting a foul to be called, and since they've gotten into Big Ten play, they're not getting a lot of those foul calls. And I don't know if that's because they were overacting some of their foul calls earlier in the season, and some other coaches have complained about that, but a lot of times you'll see them get close to the basket, something will happen, and then nothing's called, and sometimes players are standing there just looking, and John Graham is probably one of the most famous among them. He has that patented face down now of like shock that he can't believe a foul wasn't called or can't believe a foul was called on him. But I think that's another issue that Maryland is having when you have a team that is so dependent on free throw shooting and actually having those fouls called when they're not being called, then they don't really have an answer for that.
I think that it's not. I think that they are getting called a little bit less, but I think that they've been less smart about trying to get the foul calls. They maybe lazy is the wrong word, but they haven't. Trimble especially hasn't been as savvy as he had been in the earlier in the year. He was so good early in the year at getting those foul calls, and he really hasn't been driving to the lane as much and getting the ones that will be called in college basketball. If you drive to the lane and do the Melo Trimble thing, where he'll take the shot and he'll cock his head back, that will get called. But he hasn't been doing that as much, and I think that goes back to what I was saying about he needs to try and be more ball dominant and try and really establish himself. Probably before trying to establish Des Wells or Jake Layman, because that'll come. When Melo's on his game, he can get the other guys the open looks, and that's the next progression of his game. And if he's able to combine what we saw in the second half against Penn State with what we saw against Iowa, that's when he'll become an honest-to-goodness National Player of the Year candidate and a All-American candidate. Right now, he's, an All-Big Ten candidate, easily All-Big Ten freshman, lock probably. But if he can do both of those things, and there's no reason he can't, because that's a lot of players in the past have done that. That's when he'll really take the next step in his game.
And I think it's interesting on a couple of points about Melo Trimble and about Maryland with shooting free throws. This has been an essential thing for them all year. I mean, in terms of free throw margin, even as they've regressed lately, this is still the best team in the country by free throw margin when you count offense and defense. I mean, it can't be overstated how important it's been for them. But if you talk to people inside Maryland, and Mark Turgeon won't say it publicly because he's obviously very defensive of both his player and wary of saying anything that would get him in trouble. But I think Melo Trimble, to some extent, made his own bed at the beginning of the year. I mean, he is excellent at drawing fouls. But part of what that entails, I think, is sort of selling your soul to the devil with things like snapping back your head and kind of demonstrating a theatrical side. And fortunately or unfortunately, conference officials adjust to that. And I think there's also a certain factor that says that Melo Trimble's a freshman, and freshmen in a league with a lot of veteran guards, despite all that you hear about D'Angelo Russell and James Blackman and Trimble. I think it's tough for a freshman to continue to get those calls, and it's hurt.
I think one other issue that we haven't really touched on a lot, and that is the way Jake Layman has kind of shot over the past 5 games. Layman is Maryland's highest-ranked player in terms of offensive rating, and over his past 5 games, he's been held under his season average. Right now, he's averaging 13.5 points per game. Over his past 5 games, he has had 13 points, 8 points, 10 points, 10 points, and then 4 points against Iowa. And I really think he needs to be getting more touches, but he also kind of has to shoot his way out of a little bit of a slump that he's been in as well. Over the past 9 of the, 28 shots that he's taken.
Yeah, Jake Layman actually talked today or yesterday at. Andrew, can we edit this?
Sure. I mean, yeah. Be silent for 3 seconds so it marks it for me, though.
All right. Jake Layman actually talked yesterday a little bit about what's ailed him offensively in the last couple of games, and the thing that he kept coming back to was that he thinks he needs to assert himself more in the post. I think Layman's really taken to this idea of being a power forward. Obviously, it's coincided with him having the best year of his career, and depending on who you talk to, it could be his ticket to being a professional prospect or a professional player sooner or later. And I think what he is focusing on, and he's mentioned a lot over the course of the year, kind of manning up against Rob Carter in practice, is this idea of becoming a dominant post player like the one that we've talked so much about how Maryland lacks.
Yeah, honestly, the Robert Carter thing, I think is a big deal. Oh, hold on. I hear a. Does anyone hear an echo?
I hear it.
Yes.
I hear it.
Did someone put down their head?
Not I.
If you put down your headphones, it'll loop back through. It's not gonna.
What are we supposed to?
No, I said if you put down your headphones near the microphone, it'll loop back through. Now I'm good. I don't know what happened.
Yeah, you sound fine now.
Yeah.
All right. So, what do we want to do here about going into tomorrow's game? Pete? Do you want to take us there soon?
Yeah. I can talk about that and then recruit.
Let me make my Robert Carter point, and then we'll go into. I'll bring us right into IU, and I'll throw it over to Pete. All right. So, what's the last thing you said, or someone said?
I was saying that Jake Layman wants to be.
He was going up against Robert Carter.
Yeah.
All right. 3, 2. Yeah, and on the topic of Robert Carter, I really do think, and this may be a little simplistic, that a lot of Maryland's problems, especially on offense, will be remedied next year with the addition of Robert Carter. Uh, just having a guy like that who demands so much attention, especially on by the defense in the paint, and as a guy who's so dynamic on offense, who can also float to the outside and kind of pound in the paint, will really open up Maryland shooters, and guys like Jared Nickens and Deion Wiley and even Jalen Brantley, who's an excellent shooter, who's coming in next year, will get a lot more space, a lot more opportunities. And I even think that if they don't get Diamond Stone, which I mean, some people say it's more likely than other people say. I would start Robert Carter at the 5 because you really don't need someone, a consummate rim protector to win in college basketball. As long as you're playing good fundamental defense, you don't need that 7-footer in the paint. But that could be a really dominant offense with Robert Carter at the 5. But anyway, we've talked enough about what's happened. Let's talk more about what's coming. Maryland has a huge game against Indiana tonight. Pete, you wrote a really nice preview. What are your thoughts on the game tonight?
Well, thank you, Andrew. I think it's going to be a tough game. I mean, we saw Indiana play Maryland out of the stadium, I would say, is one way of putting it. I mean, it was a close game at parts, but I think it really that's kind of where Maryland's rut started. This is an opportunity for them to kind of go back and start anew, break it off with the team that started it, but it's hard for me to see it. I mean, part of it is just recency bias. I've seen how Maryland's been playing recently, and it's hard to see that team beating this Indiana team. Now, Indiana doesn't play very good defense. They score a lot, but they don't play very good defense. So there is the opportunity for Maryland's offense to get back on track, whether that's through Des Wells or someone else. But we'll have to see, how much the home environment helps them.
I think something that's going to be interesting, and it's funny because Andrew was just mentioning the lack of a need for a consummate rim protector in college basketball. Indiana most certainly does not have that. I mean, Indiana starts 6'6" Colin Hartman and 6'7" Troy Williams in its front court. Both of those guys, to varying degrees, set fire to Maryland the last time they met in Bloomington. Mark Turgeon said today that DeMonte Dodd's going to start tomorrow at center. I wonder how long that will last, given Indiana's almost complete disregard of the postgame on offense. And I think something that's going to be interesting to watch is how Maryland's wing defenders and even the ones who switch between the inside and the outside, talking, of course, about Smotrich and Lehman, how they can chase around those shooters. I think that could be what defines it here.
I think when Maryland played Indiana last time, Indiana just played their game of the year, essentially. They could not miss. It didn't matter what Maryland did. The 89 points they gave up to Indiana is the most they've given up this season. And I think Maryland scored 70 points, and in their last 5 games, that is their highest output that they've had. I think they can score against Indiana as long as they can limit Indiana, which has been a team that's struggled more on the road than they have at home for sure. I think they have a great chance to snap out of this finally. If they can carry over what they did in the second half against Iowa into the start of this Indiana game, then I think they'll be great and they can snap out the little funk that they've been in. The question is, can they get off to that good start that's really been elusive to them over the past several games?
It's hard to call this a must-win because a must-win means that we're not totally sure if they're going to make the NCAA tournament or not, and I would put about a 99% confidence in them making the NCAA tournament. But if Maryland fancies themselves a top 4 or 5 Big Ten team, this is the kind of game they have to win, and it kind of sets up perfectly to show us exactly what we have with this Maryland team, because Indiana's defense is so bad, and they've been so bad on the road, that it kind of, if Maryland can't get their offense going against this Indiana team at home in what should be a really energetic environment, then they might not do it all the rest of the year, and that's really concerning. But it also could provide a little bit of a boost because Indiana's been so bad on defense, and because there just is nobody that really scares you in the post against Indiana. A lot of the Maryland's weaknesses, Indiana doesn't really exploit. they happen to have an incredible game in Bloomington, and if they shoot 80% again, they're going to win. I don't think we're going to debate that, but it's going to tell us a lot. I think more than a lot of the games have.
I think you're absolutely right, Andrew. And I think another thing people have to start taking into account as we get into the last part of this Big Ten schedule is that Maryland really needs to position themselves in the top 4 in the Big Ten, because if you don't do that, then you're going to be playing on Wednesday or Thursday in the Big Ten tournament. If you're one of the top 4 seeds, you get that double bye, and if they want to do well in their first Big Ten tournament, they really need to get that double bye. And winning games like this against Indiana and closing out strong over their last several games of their first Big Ten season is going to be really important to doing that.
Yeah, so that's basically the. Alex, are you trying to talk?
Yeah, I accidentally muted myself. Sorry.
Did you have a point to make?
Yeah, I mean, I
Yeah.
could make a point, but I don't.
Make a point. Okay, let's give it a few seconds.
How long until we want to wrap this up?
Let's give it. Why don't you make the point, and then why don't you go on to? Do you want to talk about expectations? Like I thought, maybe talking about maybe rejiggering expectations and not thinking they're going to. I think we just go on to mishmash stuff after this.
Yeah,
Okay.
go into the tournament some, because that's such a hot topic issue right now,
Yeah.
and I think people need to realize Maryland is making the tournament, and
that's a good thing.
Right,
And
that's a good thing, and that's the expectations that most of us had at the start of this season. And just
All right,
because
so Alex, make your point, and then throw it to Dave about that.
Should we end it there instead of hitting football, because it's like a week after signing day?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay.
I would think maybe we talk Cowan a little bit, because that's a kind of huge deal. But otherwise, we don't have to.
I mean, we could
All right.
hold town for another night.
Sure. Yeah.
Well, if it's all right with y'all, I'm just gonna head out then, because I was supposed to head out at 10, and I didn't watch the Iowa game, so I can't help all that much.
All right.
Okay. Yeah.
Alex, why don't you make your point, and then we can maybe just touch on Cowan and NCAA tournament, and then we'll be done.
Okay, sounds good. I'm gonna add like a 5-second thing about this Indiana game before I throw it over.
Yeah. Okay, so let's give it some silence so I know where to cut it.
Yeah, it promises to be a pretty interesting night tonight at Xfinity Center. Obviously, Indiana brings one of the best offenses in college basketball, the 5th most efficient offense in all of college basketball, into College Park. So it'll be a pretty significant test for Maryland's defense as well as its offense. And I think more than that, this is, next to Maryland's game against Wisconsin, the last great precursor to what does figure to be Maryland's first time in the NCAA tournament in a half-decade. And I think this is something that probably hasn't been talked about enough over the last couple of days because of where the program's been in the shortest of terms. But we're only about a month away at this point from Maryland's return to the NCAA tournament.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Alex. A lot of people entering this season kind of thought Maryland was a bubble team and maybe even a fringe bubble team at that.
If that.
And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that, coming into the season, Maryland had 5 players that transferred out, and some of them were very good players. I mean, Seth Allen was a very good player. Charles Mitchell was a really good offensive rebounder. And then you have 5 freshmen coming in who you don't know how they're going to adjust to life in college. You don't know how they're going to do, especially during the stretch run. I think people thought Trimble was going to be good, but I don't think anyone could have expected him to be as good and dominant as he has been. So the fact that Maryland is, they're not on the bubble. They are solidly in the tournament, even with the way they've struggled. Just look at the seedings and projections for them, even if as they've slipped in the AP poll, they're still being projected as, a 3, 4, 5 seed. So the lowest projection you're seeing for them is a 6 or 7 seed. So even during all this struggle, you have to look at Maryland's full body of work. You have to look at those wins against Iowa State, against Oklahoma State, that's looking even better as the days go on. The Arizona State win is looking better. And then the wins that they have gotten in Big Ten play look very good too. I mean, I don't think any of us thought the win against Purdue was going to look as well as it does. So you really have to look at that full body work, not the last 5 games in which they have struggled. And I think they're going to have an opportunity to continue to build on that resume, but their resume is already extremely strong, and people need to remember that.
Yeah, I mean, they are well past where anyone could have expected them to be at this time. And like Alex said, even with, and like Dave said, both of you guys, even with the recent struggles, they have such a nice resume. They still have not lost to a bad team, and almost no team in the country can say that. And even looking, a little bit further into the future, because it's pretty safe to say they'll make the tournament. Even if they end up as a 6 or 7 seed, that's way better than most expected. I would have been happy with a 10 or 12 seed coming into this year. And they've really positioned them well moving forward. With Robert Carter being added and only really losing Des Wells as a significant contributor for next year, don't be surprised going to next year, assuming a non-total collapse by Maryland. Like, they would need to either miss the tournament or end up in like the first 4 or something as a 12 seed. But barring that, you're going to see Melo Trimble on preseason All-American teams. You're going to see Maryland as a projected, potential top 10, 15 preseason team. You're going to see at least Melo Trimble and probably Jake Layman on the preseason All-Big Ten team. You're going to see Melo Trimble as a preseason All-Big Ten Player of the Year candidate, maybe even the leading candidate behind maybe Yogi Ferrell.
Or Blackman, maybe.
Yeah, but Blackman's been good.
Or Ohio State's new freshman guard, who's going to be the new D'Angelo Russell.
No one's D'Angelo. If we're going to get off this for a second, D'Angelo Russell was not even a consensus top 15 recruit.
I know, right? Wow.
What he's doing is insane, and I kind of hope the Knicks draft him as a Knicks fan. But that's not the norm. A non-top 15 recruit being this good early on is not the norm, and no one's gonna be the next D'Angelo Russell.
Yeah, but it'll be interesting. There's still going to be a lot of talent in the Big Ten next year.
I think next year. I guess we're going to finish with this because a little bit of just a thought, random thoughts. Maryland, Indiana, and Ohio State are going to be the big 3 in the Big Ten next year.
No, Wisconsin.
Wisconsin loses. Look how much Wisconsin loses. I mean, they're going to be good.
They lose a lot
because Wisconsin's always good, and especially if they get Diamond Stone. If they get Diamond Stone, they're going to be, it's going to be Maryland, Wisconsin, Indiana, Ohio State battling it out. But they're going to lose Kaminsky. They're probably going to lose Decker. They're going to lose Trayvon Jackson. Bronson Koenig's going to be really good. Nigel Hayes is going to be really good.
Yeah.
But they are going to take a step back because everyone takes a step back when they lose a guy like Frank Kaminsky and probably Sam Decker and Trayvon Jackson and Josh Gosser. So you're losing 3 starters, maybe 4 starters.
By the way, did you know that Josh Gasser has the highest offensive efficiency rating in the country?
Because he has the best job in the country.
Of thousands of players.
That's the best job in the country, to be Josh Gosser.
It's not a bad
next to Nigel. What?
It's not a bad game. Yeah.
No, it's like being it's like when James Harden was on the Thunder. Like, yeah, you have Russell Westbrook and Kevin Durant. You're gonna have a good time. That's gonna be fun for you.
Yeah.
I really do. Sorry.
He is a gunner.
He's a gunner. I love Josh Gosser.
Yeah.
But those are going to be. I mean, Maryland is going to be picked, by someone to win the Big Ten next year because there's not a clear-cut favorite like there was this year. So even if Maryland's kind of struggles on the stretch, and even if they do end up going maybe 22 and whatever that would be, that is a huge step for the program. This is a massive step forward in the program this year.
Yeah, I certainly agree. And it'll be, no matter what you think of Wisconsin's prospects, it'll be a tight race at the top of the Big Ten. Whether or not there's a clear front runner like the Badgers have been this year or not. Just pause for a second. I'll sign off because I was reading that. Am I good to go in a minute, or do you want to say anything else? Okay.
Is there anything else you guys want to touch on?
I'm ready to sign off. Watch an episode of something, possibly Parks and Rec, and then go to sleep.
I have work in the morning, Alex. Work, okay. So
I actually have nothing till noon tomorrow. It's amazing.
Oh.
Yeah.
I have to get up at 5:30, so.
I have to go to work where I set up legendary Vermont coaches Tom Brennan's Twitter account like I did today. That was my work today.
Really?
Yeah, he has a Twitter account now because I set it up for him.
Yeah.
That's awesome. All right, well, we can go back, and Alex, you want to take us out?
Yeah, I'll take us out. 3, 2. So anyway, all of it for Maryland starts tonight at Xfinity Center. I'll be there. I'm sure Andrew, Dave, and Pete will be weighing in from wherever they are on Twitter throughout the night. My father will be actually making the trip up to College Park with his Indiana alum friend, and they got some pretty good seats. I can't believe it. But we'll be at Buffalo Wild Wings beforehand and possibly afterward. If anyone would
So go say hi to Alex.
Yeah, so I mean, please come out and share some garlic parm wings. And with that, I think it's time to go. So for Andrew Emmer, Dave Tucker, and Pete Volk, we will see you on the next edition of the Testudo Times podcast. And thanks for your continued readership and listening today.